Antifa. You hear that word a lot, and it definitely sparks some intense debate. But what are the actual ideas behind it? Well, today, we're going to go inside one of the most influential books on the subject, Mark Bray's Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. Our goal here isn't to take a side. It's simply to understand the history and the philosophy that are presented inside its pages. So, let's get into it.
Right off the bat, the book hits you with this quote from the Spanish anarchist Buenaventura Durruti: "Fascism is not to be debated, it is to be destroyed." Wow, that one sentence is incredibly uncompromising, and it really captures the core philosophy we're about to explore. It immediately tells you that from this perspective, this isn't a debate to be won, it's a threat to be eliminated.
And that's really what we're trying to do here. We're not here to endorse this or to condemn it, but just to understand it. We're going to use only the handbook as our guide to unpack the history, the arguments, and the ideas that lead to such a powerful and frankly controversial position.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll talk about the handbook itself. Then we'll get into how it defines the struggle. After that, we'll dive into what it calls a hidden history. Then look at the tactical playbook, see how it applies in the modern era, and finally, we'll wrap up with its core argument.
So what is this book exactly? Well, the author presents it as the very first history of its kind in English, one that specifically traces the story of anti-fascism after World War II. The goal is to connect all these seemingly separate movements from different countries and different decades and show them as one single continuous tradition.
What's really fascinating here is how the author, Mark Bray, put this together. He didn't just, sit in a library reading old documents. He actually went out and interviewed 61 active and former anti-fascists from 17 different countries. This gives the book a really unique, on-the-ground perspective, and it focuses specifically on a tradition that combines socialist politics with a strategy of direct action.
Okay, so let's get down to basics. On the most fundamental level, how does the handbook actually define anti-fascism? It argues that it's way more than just, being passively against fascism. Instead, it's a very specific political tradition that's built around a core disagreement with how mainstream society thinks we should handle it.
And here it is, the core definition from the book. Anti-fascism, in this context, is a political tradition that says no to the classic liberal idea that we should defend free speech for everyone, including fascists. The book argues that just waiting for the government or for rational debate to stop them is a huge mistake, and that what's actually needed is autonomous, physical opposition.
And this quote just perfectly illustrates that dividing line. You know that famous ideal, often attributed to Voltaire, about defending to the death someone's right to say something you hate? Well, according to the handbook, this is exactly what the anti-fascist tradition rejects. The book's argument is that after the historical reality of the Holocaust, defending a Nazi's right to speak became for these activists not just a moral failure, but a strategic one.
This chart does a great job of breaking down that strategic split. On one side, you have what the book calls the liberal response, which relies on institutions like the police and on the power of debate in the marketplace of ideas. But on the other side, you have militant anti-fascism, which is skeptical of the state, totally rejects debating fascists, and focuses on preemptively shutting down their ability to organize. It's a fundamental shift from being reactive to being proactive.
Now, one of the biggest claims the handbook makes is that this is not a new phenomenon. Bray argues that militant anti-fascism isn't just some recent trend that popped up. Instead, he says, it's part of a hidden history, a continuous, century-long tradition of direct opposition that's been happening all along.
The book argues you can trace this lineage through all these key historical moments. It starts back in the 1920s, with groups like the Arditi del Popolo, literally fighting Mussolini's black shirts on the streets of Italy. It continues to 1936 London with the Battle of Cable Street, where a whole coalition of people physically blocked a fascist march. After the war, you had the 43 Group, made up of Jewish veterans, who would violently break up fascist rallies. And that same thread, the book argues, continues right into the 1980s American punk scene, where anti-racist action directly confronted neo-Nazi skinheads.
And this quote here, from a French communist newspaper back in the 1920s after a deadly street fight with fascists, really captures that historical mindset. The book presents this not as some one-off incident, but as part of a long-standing belief that physical confrontation was just a necessary response to fascist provocation.
Okay, so if that's the history and the philosophy, what do they actually do? What are the tactics? The book dedicates a lot of space to what it calls the anti-fascist playbook, the actual practical strategies used to confront fascism. This idea, which is presented by an organizer in the book, just perfectly captures the logic of preemption. The point isn't to seek out violence. It's about using the minimum amount of force necessary as early as possible to stop something much worse from happening. The thinking goes like this. You fight with letters now, so you don't have to fight with fists later. You fight with fists, so you don't have to fight with knives. The whole goal is to stop a movement when it's small, to avoid a much bloodier conflict down the road. It's framed as a fundamentally defensive strategy.
And it's not all just physical. The book details a whole spectrum of tactics, and a lot of them are nonviolent. Things like researching and publicly identifying fascists, what we now call doxing, pressuring venues to cancel their events, and doing community education. It also includes stuff like painting over graffiti, making a ton of noise to drown out speakers, and organizing blockades. And yes, at the far end of that spectrum, it absolutely includes direct physical confrontation.
But here's the key thing. All of these different tactics, from writing a letter all the way to throwing a punch, they're all united by one single strategic goal that the handbook calls no platform. The core idea is to deny fascists any opportunity to publicly promote their views, to recruit new members, or to build a movement. The belief is if you take away their platform, you take away their power.
So, how does this century-old playbook actually apply today? Well, the book argues that the rise of the far right in the 21st century has created a major strategic crisis for this traditional kind of anti-fascism.
This quote from a German activist who was interviewed in the book just gets right to the heart of the problem. Street fighting tactics that might work against a small gang of neo-Nazi skinheads, they become pretty ineffective or even backfire when you're suddenly facing a mass political movement that can draw thousands of people to a rally and win a big chunk of the vote.
So this is the key question the book really wrestles with. What do you do when the threat is no longer some fringe subculture, but a populist political party that has a clean image and a huge base of support? The old tactics might not be enough anymore.
And the answer, at least according to the activists Bray interviewed, is a strategic evolution. The book describes a shift away from these small, secret groups that were focused on physical confrontation and a move toward building bigger, more open and popular movements. This means creating broad coalitions and really digging into community organizing to offer a compelling alternative to the far right's message.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together. After looking at the history, the tactics, and the modern challenges, what is the single most important argument at the very center of the Anti-Fascist Handbook?
It really boils down to this. The book's ultimate thesis is that fascism is not just another opinion in the marketplace of ideas. Instead, it is framed as a uniquely dangerous and inherently violent ideology. And because of that, the handbook concludes you just can't treat it like any other political position. It has to be confronted and stopped before it can even organize. Because, as the book argues, history shows that once it gets a foothold, the time for debate is already over. This quote really captures the central criticism that the handbook is constantly pushing back against. That common argument that shutting down speech, even really hateful speech, is itself a fascist tactic. The handbook fundamentally rejects that. It argues that the content and the intent of the speech matter far more than the abstract principle of just letting every idea be heard. And that brings us to the final, really provocative question that just hangs over this entire philosophy. If we accept the book's premise that some ideas are simply too dangerous to be allowed a platform, well, that leaves us with a profound challenge. Who decides? Who gets to decide what those ideas are? Who has the authority to draw that line? And what are the risks if you get it wrong? That's the core tension, right at the heart of the Anti-Fascist Handbook.